Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to our discussion of specific facts about New England. I am Miss Jennifer Blank, and I will be your guide on this journey. We left off discussing Roger Williams, and we had wrapped up our brief discussion of him. We're going to read and learn more about him in the coming days, but right now, I want to turn your attention to one of my favorite historical figures, Miss Anne Hutchinson. Now, the only thing worse than being a rebel in Puritan culture was being a female rebel in Puritan culture. So let's talk about Anne Hutchinson. So she was an intelligent, strong-willed, well-spoken woman. That's already public enemy number one. Like if you as a woman are any of these things, it's not good times for the patriarchy, right? The patriarchy is not a fan of this. So obviously, she threatened patriarchal control, right? And she had this thing called antinomialism, okay, and this concept of direct revelation. All right, this of course it's against the law, so that's not good. That's a bad times. She carried to logical extremes the Puritan doctrine of predestination. We're going to take a look later on at some, not in this lesson, but as a class, at some excerpts from her trial where she ran intellectual circles around the Puritan male leadership. And it is good times, let me assure you. So to her, the holy life was no sure sign of salvation, right? Which is interesting because I want you to think about what that means, right? That the holy life was no sure sign of salvation, and the truly saved didn't actually need to obey the law of either God or man. So I want you to contemplate what that might have meant for a guy like John Winthrop. That basically means, right, that you don't have to follow anything Winthrop says. So this obviously not only was this a problem for the patriarchy, it was also a problem for Winthrop specifically, right? So at her trial, she confounded the Puritan for days. Like this trial went on for days, right? So she's, just continuing to call them out on their hypocrisy and on their lack of intellectual and ideological consistency. And they really didn't have much to say in response because she was right. She caught them up in their socks. It was great. Eventually she bragged that she received her beliefs directly from God, right? Which means, now listen, so God is supposed to talk to like the guy, right? So John Winthrop is the guy. So God should be talking to him, right? But if God is talking directly to her, that could perhaps mean that he is not in fact the guy, that perhaps she's the girl, right? So again, threat to the patriarchy and to John Winthrop specifically. So Puritan leaders obviously were not on board with any of this, and it didn't matter that she was correct and that all of her criticisms and accusations of hypocrisy were absolutely correct. That didn't matter because they're like, you were banished because you're making us look bad, basically. So she and her family traveled to Rhode Island first and then later on to New York, right? So you see, at this point, 1638, so Roger Williams has already founded his colony, right? So, and that's Rhode Island. So she has a place to go. She really should have stayed there, but instead she went to New York. And everybody in her family but one was killed in what is now Westchester County. So unfortunately, Anne Hutchinson's story ends there. And, John Winthrop, of course, thought this was divine providence and that God had, smite her down, but whatever. She still got the better of him. And we look back at Anne Hutchinson and say, she's good times and one John Winthrop's a jerk, right? So, how's that for your historical legacy? So let's talk about Puritans versus Native Americans in a more general sense, because you need to make a distinction between the initial Puritans who came to the New World and like 3 or 4 generations down the line. Unfortunately, the grandsons and great-grandsons and great-great-grandsons of the original settlers would not be as kind to the Indians as they should have been, and certainly not like their ancestors were. So Indians were especially weak in New England, and as the years and generations went on, more and more of their population was decimated. So initially, the settlers were befriended, and that was the key reason that those of them that did survived at all, was because they befriended the Native Americans, and the Native Americans helped them, right? So you have cooperation, and there was a treaty that was actually signed in 1621 between the Indians and the settlers. And this is where you get the celebration of the first Thanksgiving. Part of it was a celebration of that camaraderie, that collaboration, that befriending, right? So now let's move into the Pequot Wars, right? So the Pequot Wars, you should be at least somewhat familiar with this because in previous lessons I required you to go to some links and research them. So the Pequot Wars, 1636, 1637, right? Pequots were a very peaceful tribe. This is Connecticut, the state from which I hail. So they were a very powerful tribe in this area. In 1637, you do get the Pequot War. So whites with the Narragansett Indian allies attacked the Pequot village on Mystic River, right? So remember, some of the Puritan settlers had formed alliances with some Indian tribes, not all Indian tribes. So when the Narragansetts were like, hey, listen, so we like helped you out, like, and taught you like how to like not die when you were here and you didn't know any better. So we've got these Pequot people that we don't like them much and we're going to take them out. So how about you bring yourselves and your guns and you help us do that? So the Puritans were like, sure, we got you, you know. So they went and they attacked the Pequots and basically wiped them out. They set fire to their homes. They shot anybody who was fleeing, men, women, children. They did not discriminate, unfortunately. So the Pequot tribe was virtually annihilated. There was an uneasy peace that lasted for about 40 years, but unfortunately, it's not going to help the Pequots much. They were basically wiped out because of this. King Philip's War, right? So the only hope for Native Americans to resist white settlers was to unite. So this guy, King Philip, attempted to do just that. Metacom was his native name, but he was known as King Philip to white settlers, right? So the chief that originally created the treaty, right? Remember couple slides back, right? Let's go back just a little bit. See that guy? Yeah, created the treaty with the settlers, right? So let's go now. Here we are. He united the Indians and he staged coordinated attacks on white settlements throughout New England. That's this guy, right? Frontier settlements were forced to retreat to Boston, right? So there were people who struck out on their own and then they had to go back from whence they came. So this just gives you an idea of this little map here. So Indian settlements, you've got like little red triangles there, or like diamonds, I guess you could say, whatever. And then the English settlements that attacked, right? So you can see the ones that were attacked versus where the Indian settlements were, just to give you an idea of how that war shook out, right? So the war ended in failure for the Indians. Unfortunately, they didn't have the technology to compete, right? It's just the colonists had guns. Metacom was beheaded, drawn and quartered. That's not it's not a good way to go, man. That's painful way to go. Sadly, his son and wife were also sold into slavery, so the colonists were not kind to him or his predecessor, people who came after him, descendants. Thank you. Sorry, was having trouble coming up with the word. But at this point, even though King Philip tried to do it, there was never a serious threat in New England again. By this point, a lot of the Native Americans are just wiped out. All right, so population New England colonies. I want you to look at where we are here. So white shoots up, right around a little after 1700. Boom, by 1750, that's a lot of people, right? I want you to notice the Native American stayed pretty much flat because a lot of them were already wiped out, right? So that stayed flat, and even Black Americans stayed flat. I'm sorry, Native Americans started out here and then just dropped off into nothingness. Black Americans were never a major presence in terms of slave populations in New England. And I want you to remember this because in New England, slavery as a labor system isn't necessary, not even really viable. So there's no point in bringing slaves into New England, really. There are very few. And the ones who were there were enslaved for very long and very quickly were able to become free. So you didn't have a super large population of blacks in New England. This accounts for massive cultural differences that developed between the colonial regions. So I want you to pay attention to that. All right, population comparisons, New England versus Chesapeake, right? So this is, you can see settled areas in 1650, right? So you can see, look at all the settlement that has happened by 1650 in New England and compare that to the Chesapeake. So the population center was clearly New England, not the Chesapeake, not where, even though Jamestown was the first permanent English settlement, you didn't get a big increase in population until later on. And if you look at male life expectancy in the 17th century, which is the 1600s, New England was far higher than England, where everybody came from, or the Chesapeake. Chesapeake was actually the worst, right? So you just keep that in mind. All right, let's talk about New York. We're now jumping in, ladies and gentlemen, to the middle. You know what? I'm going to stop here. We're going to jump into the middle colonies in the next video lesson. So I'm going to stop this. This ends our discussion of New England. I hope you learned what you needed to, and I will see you in the next video where we will discuss in detail some of the middle colonies. Hope you learned what you needed to, and I will see you next time.